The air in the crowded fields outside Clermont in November 1095 was thick with anticipation, but no one present could have fully understood that they were standing at the edge of a moment that would reshape centuries of history. Because when Pope Urban II rose to speak, he did not simply address a council of clergy and nobles. He ignited something far more powerful, something that would move entire populations across continents. His voice carried over the masses, not just as a sermon, but as a call that reached deep into the fears, hopes, and beliefs of medieval Europe, describing a distant land, the Holy Land, where sacred places tied to the life of Christ were said to be suffering under Muslim control, and whether every detail of his speech was exactly as later chroniclers recorded or not, what mattered was the effect. People believed, and belief was enough. He promised something extraordinary, something almost unimaginable in a world where sin weighed heavily on every soul. Complete remission of sins, a clean slate before God, granted to anyone who took up the cross and marched east, and that promise spread like wildfire. Because in a deeply religious society where salvation defined life and death, this was not just an opportunity, it was an answer. Knights saw glory and redemption. Peasants saw purpose. Younger sons of noble families, who would inherit nothing at home, saw destiny, and clergy saw divine mission. And within months, what had begun as words became movement, and what had been an idea became an army. Across regions like France, the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, and Norman territories, people began preparing in ways that blurred the line between pilgrimage and war, sewing red crosses onto their garments, selling lands, abandoning homes, saying goodbye to families with the belief that they might never return. But if they didn't, they would die in the service of God. But this rising tide was not orderly, not yet. Before the great lords even organized their forces, waves of common people surged forward in what would later be called the People's Crusade, poorly equipped, untrained, driven by faith rather than strategy, and many of them would never even reach the Holy Land, falling instead to hunger, disease, or violence long before they ever saw the walls of Jerusalem. And yet, behind them, something more formidable was forming. Real armies, led by powerful nobles whose names would echo through history. Men like Godfrey of Bouillon, a deeply religious and disciplined leader who would become one of the central figures of the entire campaign, Bohemond of Taranto, ambitious and cunning, a veteran of wars in the Byzantine world, Raymond IV of Toulouse, one of the wealthiest and most powerful nobles to take the cross, and Tancred of Hauteville, bold, aggressive, and hungry for both glory and land. These were not dreamers. They were experienced commanders, each bringing their own armies, their own ambitions, and their own interpretations of what this holy war truly meant. By 1096, tens of thousands had begun the journey east, moving across Europe like a slow, unstoppable tide, passing through lands unfamiliar to them, entering the domain of the Byzantine Empire, a powerful but cautious ally that viewed these Western armies with both hope and deep suspicion. Because from the Byzantine perspective, these crusaders were not just saviors. They were unpredictable, undisciplined at times, culturally different, and dangerously numerous. Still, the emperor had little choice but to cooperate, ferrying them across the Bosporus into Anatolia, where the real test would begin, not against fellow Christians, but against the forces of the Seljuk Turks, masters of the terrain and warfare styles the Crusaders barely understood. And almost immediately, the reality of the journey set in. This was not a glorious march. It was suffering. The land was harsh, supply lines were unreliable, and food became scarce, forcing armies to survive off what they could forage, take, or fight for, and disease spread easily among men who marched for months under brutal conditions, many dying not in battle, but in silence, along dusty roads far from home. The Seljuk Turks did not meet them in grand, decisive battles at first. Instead, they harassed them, striking quickly and disappearing just as fast, using mounted archers who could attack from a distance and retreat before the heavily armored knights could respond. It was a different kind of war, and the Crusaders had to learn fast. Every mile forward came at a cost. Every victory was uncertain. But what drove them onward was not just leadership, not just strategy. It was belief, the same belief that had been sparked back in Clermont, now tested under the weight of exhaustion, fear, and death. And still they kept moving, toward a city they had never seen, toward a goal that seemed both distant and inevitable, toward a destiny that would soon turn from struggle into something far more brutal than anything they had yet faced. The moment the Crusaders stepped fully into Anatolia, the illusion of a guided pilgrimage vanished completely, because what lay ahead was not a road. It was a battlefield stretched across an entire land, and the first major test came sooner than many expected, near the city of Nicaea, a stronghold held by the Seljuk Turks and a key gateway into the deeper regions of Asia Minor. Nicaea was no ordinary target. It was fortified, organized, and strategically vital, and for the Crusaders, capturing it would mean more than just victory. It would prove that this massive, fragile coalition of armies could actually function as a unified force. The siege began in 1097, and almost immediately, the Crusaders realized that brute force alone would not be enough. The city's walls were strong, its defenders determined, and its position near a lake allowed it to be resupplied despite the encirclement, something the Crusaders had not fully accounted for. But this is where the uneasy alliance with the Byzantine Empire became critical, because the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had his own plans, and while he supported the Crusaders, he did not intend to let them simply claim former Byzantine territory as their own. So while the Crusaders pressed the siege from land, Byzantine forces quietly moved into position on the lake, cutting off the city's final lifeline, and in a move that would spark tension and distrust, Nicaea eventually surrendered not to the Crusaders, but to the Byzantines. When the Crusaders realized this, many were furious. They had expected plunder, reward, and recognition for their efforts, but instead, they were denied the spoils of victory, and this moment planted the first real seeds of mistrust between the Crusaders and their supposed allies, a tension that would never fully disappear. Still, the campaign moved forward, because Nicaea was only the beginning. Soon after, the Crusaders found themselves facing a far greater challenge, an open confrontation with the Seljuk forces near a place called Dorylaeum. Here, the war changed. There were no walls, no Siegenians, no waiting, only battle. The Seljuk Turks, led by experienced commanders, launched a sudden and devastating attack on the Crusader vanguard, catching them at a vulnerable moment, and what followed was chaos, because the Crusaders, heavily armored and less mobile, struggled to respond to an enemy that moved like the wind. Arrows rained down endlessly, fired from horseback by warriors who stayed just out of reach, circling, striking, retreating, and returning again, turning the battlefield into a constant storm of motion and death. The Crusaders' formation began to break. Panic spread. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire expedition might collapse right there in the dust of Anatolia. But then, something critical happened. Reinforcements arrived. The main body of the Crusader army, led by figures like Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond IV of Toulouse, pushed into the battle, and instead of scattering, they held formation. And that changed everything. Because the strength of the Crusaders was not speed, it was impact. When their heavy cavalry finally charged, fully organized and coordinated, it hit with a force the Seljuk forces could not easily withstand. And for the first time in this campaign, the Crusaders proved that if they could survive the storm, they could break it. The battle turned. The Seljuk forces withdrew, and the Crusaders stood victorious. But it was not a clean victory. It was a warning. They had learned, painfully, that this war would not be fought on their terms. From that point on, the march across Anatolia became a slow grind of endurance rather than a series of decisive battles. The land itself becoming an enemy, dry, unforgiving, with long stretches where water was scarce and food even scarcer. Horses died. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Armor that once symbolized strength became a burden under the relentless sun. And yet they kept moving, through scorched plains and barren hills, through land stripped bare by retreating enemies who left nothing behind for them to use. The Crusaders pushed forward, Not because it was easy, but because turning back was no longer an option. Months passed. The army shrank, but those who remained grew harder, more experienced, more dangerous. And eventually, after all that suffering, they reached something that seemed almost impossible after the emptiness of Anatolia: a city. A massive one. A city that would become one of the most important and most brutal chapters of the entire crusade. A city called Antioch. And what awaited them there would test not just their strength, but their very will to survive. By the time the Crusaders first laid eyes on Antioch in late 1097, whatever remained of their earlier confidence began to fade, because this was not just another city standing in their path. This was a fortress on a scale many of them had never imagined, a place that seemed less like something to be conquered and more like something built to defy conquest itself. Antioch stretched across rugged terrain, its massive stone walls climbing hills and wrapping around mountains, reinforced by hundreds of towers that watched every approach, every road, every possible weakness. And behind those walls stood a determined garrison, well supplied and fully aware that the army now gathering outside was not just another invading force, but one that would not leave easily. The Crusaders surrounded the city, but almost immediately, a harsh truth became clear. They did not have enough men to fully encircle it. There were gaps, openings, paths through which supplies and reinforcements could still enter. And that meant the siege would not be quick. It would be slow, painfully slow. Winter arrived, and with it came suffering that rivaled anything they had endured on the march through Anatolia, because now they were not moving. They were stuck, forced to survive in camps that quickly became overcrowded, unsanitary, and dangerously short on food. Hunger spread first, then disease. Men who had survived months of marching began to die in growing numbers, not from enemy blades, but from weakness, infection, and despair, and the once great army began to shrink even further, its morale cracking under the weight of a siege that seemed endless. Some deserted, others lost faith, and rumors began to spread that perhaps this entire mission had been a mistake. But not everyone wavered. Leaders like Bohemond of Taranto began to look not just at the walls, but beyond them, searching for opportunities where brute force had failed, and slowly, quietly, a different kind of plan began to form. Because if Antioch could not be taken from the outside, then it might be opened from within. Months passed, and through a combination of persistence, negotiation, and secrecy, Bohemond managed to establish contact with someone inside the city, a man who guarded one of its towers, a man who could be persuaded, whether by promise, pressure, or opportunity. And then, in June 1098, after nearly 8 months of suffering, the moment came. Under the cover of darkness, a small group of crusaders approached the walls, guided by the arrangement that had been made, and one by one, they climbed, scaling the defenses that had seemed impossible to breach, slipping into the city before anyone fully understood what was happening. The gates were opened, and suddenly, the siege ended, not with a grand assault, but with a breach born of patience and calculation. The Crusaders flooded in, and what followed was chaos. Street fighting erupted across Antioch, brutal, close, and relentless, as defenders and civilians alike were caught in the violence. And in the end, the city fell. Not gradually, but all at once, collapsing under the weight of an enemy that had finally broken through. But victory did not bring relief, because almost immediately, the situation turned. The Crusaders, now inside Antioch, found themselves trapped. A massive Muslim relief army, led by Kerboga, arrived and surrounded the city, turning the conquerors into the besieged, cutting off their supplies just as they had once tried to do to others. And now, everything they had endured began again. Food ran out, completely. Horses were eaten, then dogs, then anything that could keep a man alive another day. Starvation became so severe that even the strongest began to weaken, and once again, morale began to collapse because this time there was no clear path forward. They had taken the city, but they might die inside it. Desperation grew, and then, in the middle of that desperation, something happened that would change everything. Not through strategy, not through force, but through belief. A man named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received a vision, a divine message revealing the location of a holy relic hidden within the city, the Holy Lance, the very spear said to have pierced the side of Christ during the crucifixion. At first, many doubted, but desperation has a way of turning doubt into hope. Excavations began. Days passed. Nothing. And then, suddenly, something was found. A spearhead. Whether it was truly what they believed it to be did not matter in that moment, because what it gave them was something far more powerful than certainty. It gave them belief again. And belief was enough to make starving men stand up and fight. Soon after, with renewed determination, the Crusaders did something that seemed almost impossible. Instead of waiting to die behind the walls, they marched out of the city, out to face an army that outnumbered them. And what happened next would not just decide the fate of Antioch. It would prove that this crusade was far from over. The gates of Antioch opened not for retreat, but for something far more dangerous, because what stepped out that day was not a well-fed, well-rested army ready for battle. It was a force on the edge of collapse, men weakened by starvation, disease, and months of siege, yet somehow driven forward by something stronger than physical strength, something that had taken hold after the discovery of the Holy Lance, whether real or not. It had given them a reason to believe they could still win. Outside the city waited the army of Kerboga, larger, fresher, and confident, expecting to finish what starvation had already begun, because from every logical perspective, the Crusaders should have been defeated easily, but logic does not always decide history. The Crusader leaders understood that hesitation would mean destruction, so they organized their forces into divisions, maintaining discipline despite exhaustion, placing their most capable commanders at key points, with men like Bohemond of Taranto taking central roles in coordinating the attack. And what mattered now was not numbers, but unity, because unlike many medieval armies that fractured under pressure, this force had learned through suffering how to hold together. When they advanced, it was not a chaotic charge, it was controlled, deliberate, step by step, forcing the enemy to react rather than dominate, and something unexpected began to happen. The army of Kerboga, despite its size, was not as unified as it appeared, made up of various factions and commanders with their own rivalries, their own doubts, and, as the battle unfolded, those cracks began to widen. The Crusaders pressed forward, and instead of breaking, they held, and when the moment came, they struck with everything they had left, and that was enough because Kerboga's forces, unsure, divided, and suddenly under real pressure, began to lose cohesion, and then, almost unbelievably, they started to retreat. What should have been a crushing defeat turned into a victory that stunned both sides, and Antioch was no longer a trap. It was secured, and for the Crusaders, this moment became proof that their mission was not just possible, but destined, at least in their eyes, and that belief would carry them forward once again. But victory did not erase the cost, because the army that remained was only a fraction of what had set out from Europe. Thousands had died, many had deserted, and those who survived were hardened, changed, no longer the same men who had answered the call at Clermont. And now, a new question emerged. What next? Some leaders, particularly Bohemond of Taranto, saw opportunity in Antioch itself, a chance to establish power, to rule, to turn conquest into control, and he would eventually claim the city as his own, creating one of the first Crusader states. But others were not satisfied because the true objective had always been Jerusalem, and stopping here would mean abandoning the very purpose that had driven them this far. Among those pushing forward was Raymond IV of Toulouse, who insisted that the journey must continue, that the holy city must be reached, and slowly, despite disagreements and delays, the remaining Crusader forces began to move south again, leaving behind Antioch and everything it represented. The march toward Jerusalem was different from everything that came before, because now they were moving through regions where control shifted constantly, where alliances were uncertain, and where the Fatimid Caliphate, rather than the Seljuks, held power over the lands ahead. And this change in enemy did not make things easier. It only added another layer of complexity to an already fragile campaign. Along the way, The Crusaders captured smaller towns and secured coastal positions, understanding now that supply lines mattered as much as battlefield victories, and they began to coordinate more carefully with maritime allies, particularly Italian city-states whose ships could provide materials, food, and support that the army alone could not sustain. Yet even with these improvements, the hardships continued. Heat replaced cold as the primary enemy. Water became precious, and every mile demanded endurance. But something had changed in the Crusaders themselves. They were no longer reacting to events. They were moving with purpose, with a single destination in mind. And then, finally, in June 1099, after years of marching, fighting, starving, and surviving, they saw it. Jerusalem, the city that had been the center of everything from the very beginning, the place that had existed in their minds long before they ever set foot on this journey, now stood before them, its walls rising from the land as both a promise and a challenge. But reaching Jerusalem was not the end. It was only the beginning of the most brutal chapter yet. The moment the Crusaders reached Jerusalem in June 1099, whatever remained of their strength was tested again, because standing before them was not a weakened prize waiting to be claimed, but a fortified city prepared for siege, defended by the forces of the Fatimid Caliphate, who had taken control of Jerusalem shortly before the Crusaders arrived and had no intention of surrendering it. The Crusaders faced an immediate and critical problem. They had reached their destination, but they were not prepared to take it, because Jerusalem's defenses were strong, its walls high and well maintained, and the surrounding land had been stripped of resources by the defenders, leaving the attackers with almost nothing to sustain themselves, no easy access to water, limited food, and very little wood for building the siege engines they would need to breach the city. For days, they struggled just to survive outside the walls, the summer heat pressing down relentlessly, men collapsing from dehydration, supplies running dangerously low, and once again, the campaign threatened to stall, not because of enemy strength alone, but because of the environment itself. But this time, the Crusaders adapted faster, because they had learned from Antioch. They knew that without siege equipment, they had no chance, so they began gathering materials from wherever they could, dismantling ships that had arrived from the Mediterranean coast, hauling timber across long distances, and constructing siege towers, ladders, and battering rams with a level of urgency that showed they understood exactly what was at stake. Leaders coordinated their efforts carefully, positioning their forces around different sections of the wall, preparing for a synchronized assault rather than a scattered attack. And among them, figures like Godfrey of Bouillon and Tancred of Hauteville played crucial roles in organizing the final push. Before the assault began, there was a moment that stood out even in the brutality of the campaign, because the Crusaders, following religious rituals, marched barefoot around the city walls in a symbolic act of penance and devotion, echoing biblical stories they believed were tied to divine intervention. And whether this act had any strategic value or not, it reinforced something that had carried them from the beginning: belief that their success was not just military, but guided. Then the attack began. Siege towers were rolled forward under constant threat, arrows and projectiles raining down from the walls as defenders fought desperately to stop them. Fire became a weapon on both sides. Attempts were made to burn the towers before they could reach the walls, while Crusaders worked frantically to protect them, pushing forward despite losses. For a time, it seemed like the defenses might hold. But then, on July 15th, 1099, everything changed. On the northern section of the wall, near what was known as Herod's Gate, the forces of Godfrey of Bouillon managed to position their siege tower successfully. And from it, men crossed onto the walls, creating a breach where none had existed before, and almost simultaneously, on another section, forces under Tancred of Hauteville applied pressure that stretched the defenders even thinner. Once the walls were compromised, the battle shifted instantly from siege to chaos. The Crusaders poured into the city, and what followed was not controlled warfare. It was a massacre. For 3 days, violence spread through Jerusalem, as Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were killed in large numbers, an event recorded in both Christian and Muslim sources, though described differently depending on the perspective. but all agreeing on one thing. The scale of the bloodshed was immense. The Crusaders, driven by years of hardship, belief, and fury, did not hold back, and the city that had been their ultimate goal became a place of destruction before it became a place of victory. Religious sites were seized and transformed. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque were stripped of their Islamic identity and repurposed, symbolizing not just military conquest, but religious dominance, at least from the Crusader perspective. And yet, in the midst of all this, there was also a moment that revealed how the Crusaders saw what they had done, because many of them went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, one of Christianity's most sacred places, and prayed, believing that they had fulfilled a divine mission, that everything they had endured had led to this moment. With Jerusalem captured, the objective of the First Crusade had been achieved. But victory did not mean stability, because holding the city would prove to be just as difficult as taking it. Jerusalem had fallen, but almost immediately, the question shifted from conquest to survival, because taking a city in a moment of violence was one thing. Holding it, defending it, and ruling it in a hostile region was something entirely different, and the Crusaders now found themselves in a land where they were not the majority, not the familiar power, but a thin layer of foreign rulers surrounded by populations that did not share their identity or their cause. At the center of this new reality stood Godfrey of Bouillon, who was offered the crown of Jerusalem but refused to be called king, choosing instead the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre, a decision that reflected both personal humility and the belief that no man should wear a crown in the city where Christ had suffered. Yet regardless of the title, the responsibility was the same. He now had to lead and protect what had been taken. But even before any real stability could form, another threat emerged because the Fatimid Caliphate was not finished. And in August 1099, only weeks after Jerusalem's capture, a massive army advanced toward the city, aiming to reclaim it before the Crusaders could secure their position. The confrontation came near Ascalon, a strategic coastal city that had long served as a base for military operations. And once again, the Crusaders, still exhausted and reduced in number, had to face a force that outmatched them in scale. But by now, they were no longer the same army that had struggled through Anatolia. They had learned, adapted, and hardened. The battle that followed would decide whether their victory in Jerusalem would last even a single season. And under the leadership of Godfrey of Bouillon, the Crusaders launched a decisive attack, using coordination and discipline to break the larger Fatimid force. And when the enemy lines collapsed, it was clear the Crusaders would hold Jerusalem, at least for now. But for now was the key, because what they had created was not a unified empire. It was a fragile network of states, each with its own ruler, its own priorities, and its own challenges, and these states would need to survive not just external enemies, but internal division. To the north, the county of Edessa emerged under Baldwin of Boulogne, controlling vital routes between regions and acting as a buffer against eastern threats, while Antioch, claimed by Bohemond of Taranto, became its own principality, strong but often politically complicated due to its leaders' ambitions and conflicts with both allies and enemies. Further along the coast, the county of Tripoli would take shape under the influence of Raymond IV of Toulouse and his successors, securing important ports and trade routes, while at the center of it all stood the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the most symbolically important, but also the most vulnerable. These states were separated by distance, divided by leadership, and constantly under threat, making coordination difficult and defense even harder, and the rulers who governed them were often younger sons of European nobility, men who had come seeking land and purpose, now finding themselves responsible for territories far more complex than anything they had known before. The population they ruled was not predominantly Latin Christian, but a mix of Muslims, Eastern Christians, and others, each with their own traditions, loyalties, and tensions, and governing such a society required more than military strength. It required adaptation, negotiation, and sometimes uneasy coexistence. Meanwhile, the success of the Crusade had an unexpected effect back in Europe. It inspired more people to come, not as soldiers, but as pilgrims, ordinary men and women who wanted to see the places they had heard about, to walk where Christ had walked, to experience something sacred. and this created a constant flow of travelers into a region that was anything but safe. The journey itself was dangerous, but the final stretch from coastal cities like Jaffa to Jerusalem became one of the most feared routes, a narrow path through difficult terrain where raiders, bandits, and hostile forces could strike without warning, and many did, targeting pilgrims who were often unarmed or poorly protected. Caravans formed for safety, groups traveling together with whatever guards they could afford. But even that was not always enough, because the land favored those who knew it, and attacks could come quickly and disappear just as fast, leaving behind silence and loss. Reports began to spread of entire groups vanishing, of travelers who never reached Jerusalem, their fate unknown, and this growing danger created a problem that the Crusader states were not fully prepared to solve, because their military systems were designed for war, not constant protection. Armies could fight battles. Castles could defend territories. But neither could guarantee the safety of every road, every traveler, every mile between the coast and the holy city. And it was within this gap, between victory and vulnerability, between control and chaos, that a new idea would begin to form, an idea that would change not just the defense of the Holy Land, but the very nature of warfare and religion itself. Because soon, a small group of men would step forward with a solution no one had truly imagined before. In the years after Jerusalem's capture, the victories of the Crusaders began to reveal their limits, because while armies could win battles and kings could hold cities, the land itself remained unpredictable, dangerous, and constantly under threat, and nowhere was this more clear than on the roads traveled by pilgrims, where faith met reality in the harshest way possible. The route from the coast to Jerusalem, especially from ports like Jaffa, became a narrow corridor of uncertainty, where travelers moved through dry hills, exposed valleys, and isolated stretches of land where help was often too far away. And despite the presence of Crusader forces in the region, protection was inconsistent, stretched thin by larger military concerns. Pilgrims came in increasing numbers, inspired by the success of the First Crusade, believing that the path to the Holy Land had been secured, but many quickly discovered that reaching Jerusalem was only part of the journey. Surviving the road to it was something else entirely. Attacks were frequent, often carried out by small, mobile groups who knew the terrain far better than any foreign army could, striking quickly, taking what they could, and disappearing before any organized response could arrive. And over time, these incidents began to shape a growing sense that something more permanent, more focused was needed. It was in this environment, around the year 1119, that a man named Hugh de Payens began to see the problem differently, not as a series of isolated attacks, but as a structural weakness in the entire system of Crusader defense. He was not one of the most famous leaders of the First Crusade, not a king or a great lord, but a minor noble from France, likely from the region of Champagne, and what made him significant was not what he had already achieved, but what he was about to propose. Instead of relying on temporary forces or scattered protection, he envisioned something entirely new, a permanent brotherhood of warriors whose sole purpose would be to defend pilgrims and secure the roads of the Holy Land, not for personal gain, not for land or titles, but as a form of religious duty. At first, this idea stood on uncertain ground, because in the traditional view of the Church, the roles of monk and warrior did not easily mix. Monks were expected to live in prayer, discipline, and withdrawal from violence, while knights lived by the sword, bound to conflict and the realities of war, and combining the two seemed, to many, contradictory. But the world of the Crusades was already changing those boundaries, and Hugh de Payens was not alone in his thinking, because he gathered around him a small group of companions, men who shared both his concern and his vision, including figures like Godfrey de Saint-Omer and others whose names would become part of the foundation of something far greater than any of them could have fully anticipated. Together, they formed a brotherhood, small at first, only about 9 members but defined not by size, but by purpose, and they took vows similar to those of monks: poverty, chastity, and obedience, committing themselves not just to fighting, but to a disciplined religious life that would guide everything they did. Their mission was simple in description, but enormous in reality: to protect pilgrims traveling to and from Jerusalem, to patrol dangerous routes, to respond quickly to threats, and to provide a level of security that no temporary army could sustain. And in doing so, they began to operate in a way that was different from any other force in the region. They did not fight for plunder. They did not seek personal wealth. They did not return home after a campaign. They stayed, constantly present, constantly active, turning the act of warfare into something continuous rather than occasional, and that alone began to set them apart. But for this brotherhood to survive, let alone grow, they needed recognition, legitimacy, and support, because without it, they would remain just a small group of armed men with an unusual idea, vulnerable to suspicion or dismissal. That recognition began to take shape under the rule of Baldwin II of Jerusalem, who had succeeded his predecessors and now faced the ongoing challenge of defending a kingdom that was still fragile and under constant pressure. At first, the idea of warrior monks was not easily accepted. It challenged established norms, raised theological questions, and required careful consideration. But at the same time, the practical need was undeniable. The kingdom needed reliable forces that could operate beyond major campaigns, forces that could handle the everyday dangers that threatened both pilgrims and stability. And so, after discussion and consideration, Baldwin II granted the group official recognition, allowing them to exist as a formal order. And more importantly, he provided them with a place to base their operations, a location that would define their identity in a way no one could have predicted. He gave them quarters on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, a place of immense significance, known to different faiths by different meanings. But in this context, it became the center of a new kind of brotherhood, one that would soon be known not just for what it did, but for what it represented. Because from that moment on, they were no longer just a group of knights. They were something new, the Knights of the Temple, the Knights Templar. And what began as 9 men with a purpose was about to grow into one of the most powerful and influential forces in the medieval world. The small brotherhood that had taken shape in Jerusalem might have remained a local solution to a local problem, but what began to change everything was not just what they did in the Holy Land. It was how their idea started to spread back across Europe, carried through stories, letters, and the growing awareness that something entirely new had been created. At the center of this transformation stood a man who would never wear armor or lead troops in a battle, yet would shape the destiny of the order more than almost anyone else, Bernard of Clairvaux. He was one of the most respected religious figures of his time, a leading voice in the Cistercian reform movement, known for his influence over both spiritual and political matters. And when he began to take interest in the Templars, it gave the order something it desperately needed: credibility at the highest level of the church. His connection was not accidental. One of the founding members of the Templars, André de Montbard, was his uncle, but what began as a family link quickly became something more, because Bernard saw in the Templars a solution to a problem that had troubled Christian thought for centuries: how to reconcile faith with the reality of war. For generations, the church had struggled with the idea that violence, even in defense, could conflict with spiritual ideals, but the Crusades had already begun to shift that thinking, and the Templars represented a further step, not just justifying war, but integrating it into religious life itself. Bernard believed this was not a contradiction, but a transformation, and so he became their voice. He wrote, he argued, he persuaded, presenting the Templars not as men who fought, but as men who served, not as warriors seeking glory, but as instruments of divine purpose. And this distinction mattered because it allowed the church to embrace them without abandoning its own principles. One of his most influential contributions came in the form of a treatise known as In Praise of the New Knighthood, where he drew a sharp line between ordinary knights, driven by pride, wealth, and reputation, and the Templars, who had renounced all of that in favor of discipline, obedience, and faith. In his view, when a Templar fought, he was not committing violence in the same way a secular knight did. He was removing evil, serving a higher purpose, and that idea, whether accepted fully or not, gave the order a powerful moral foundation that resonated deeply with both the clergy and the nobility of Europe. But words alone were not enough. For the Templars to truly expand, they needed official recognition from the church itself, something that would protect them, legitimize them, and allow them to operate beyond the limitations that applied to ordinary groups. That moment came in 1129 at the Council of Troyes, where church leaders gathered to examine the nature of this new order and decide whether it should be formally accepted. The questions were not simple. Could men who took monastic vows also fight in battle? Could they kill and still remain spiritually pure? Could such a system exist without undermining the very foundations of religious life? And for many, this required careful thought and debate. But Bernard's presence at the council proved decisive. His authority, his arguments, and his support helped guide the outcome. And in the end, the decision was made. The Knights Templar would be officially recognized as a legitimate religious order within the church. This was a turning point, because recognition meant structure. It meant rules. It meant protection. And most importantly, it meant growth. A formal rule was established, influenced by monastic traditions, but adapted to the realities of military life, defining how Templars would live, how they would pray, how they would fight, and how they would maintain discipline, creating a system that balanced spiritual commitment with constant readiness for conflict. They were required to follow strict routines of prayer, attend services whenever possible, and maintain a life free from personal wealth or individual ambition. But at the same time, they trained, they patrolled, and they fought when necessary, combining two worlds that had rarely existed together in such a structured way. Soon after, papal support expanded even further under Pope Honorius II, who granted the Templars privileges that set them apart from almost every other institution of their time, placing them directly under papal authority rather than local bishops, freeing them from many forms of interference and giving them a level of independence that was both rare and powerful. This meant they could operate across borders, answer only to the highest authority in the church, and build their own network without being restricted by regional politics in the same way others were. And then came something even more significant: support from the people. Because once the Templars were recognized and endorsed, donations began to flow in, not just from kings and nobles, but from ordinary individuals who believed in their mission, giving land, money, and resources to support what they saw as a holy cause. Across France, England, and beyond, properties were granted to the order, estates that would generate income, farms that would produce food, and centers that would recruit new members, slowly forming a network that stretched across Europe. What had started as 9 men in Jerusalem was becoming something far larger, something organized, structured, and increasingly influential. And with every new donation, every new recruit, every new connection, the Templars moved further away from being just protectors of pilgrims. They were becoming a system, a force, an institution that would not only defend the Holy Land, but reshape the way power, religion, and warfare connected across continents. And this growth was only just beginning. Once the Knights Templar received official recognition, what followed was not slow growth, but rapid expansion on a scale few could have predicted, because the moment they were legitimized by the church, they gained something more valuable than numbers: trust. And in medieval Europe, trust meant land, wealth, and influence. Across regions like France, England, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, nobles began donating estates to the order, sometimes out of genuine belief, sometimes as a way to secure spiritual favor, and sometimes because sending a son to join the Templars offered both honor and purpose without dividing family inheritance. These donations were not symbolic. They were practical. Entire farms, villages, and estates were placed under Templar control, and unlike many feudal lords, the Templars did not treat these lands as personal property, but as part of a larger system, organizing them efficiently to generate steady income that could support operations far away in the Holy Land. This is where the order began to evolve beyond a military brotherhood into something far more complex, because managing properties across multiple regions required structure, and so they developed a network of commanderies, local centers responsible for overseeing land, collecting resources, and recruiting new members, all connected through a chain of authority that stretched back to their leadership. At the top stood the Grand Master, the head of the entire order, followed by key officials responsible for military command, administration, and finance, creating a hierarchy that allowed them to operate with a level of coordination rarely seen in that era. But what truly set the Templars apart was not just their organization. It was how they used it. Because as their network grew, they began to move not just men and supplies across regions, but money. And in doing so, they created something that would quietly change the medieval world. Travel in this period was dangerous. Carrying large amounts of gold or silver made anyone a target, especially pilgrims heading toward the Holy Land, and this created a problem that the Templars were uniquely positioned to solve. Instead of carrying wealth physically, a traveler could deposit money with the Templars in one location and receive a document, a form of written credit, that could then be used to withdraw the equivalent amount elsewhere, including in Jerusalem. It was simple in concept, but revolutionary in practice, because it meant that wealth could move without being seen, without being stolen, and without the risks that had defined travel for centuries. This system did not just help pilgrims, it helped nobles, merchants, and even kings, turning the Templars into something more than soldiers. They became trusted financial intermediaries, handling transactions, safeguarding deposits, and managing funds across vast distances. And as more people relied on them, their influence grew even further because money meant power, and the Templars now had both. At the same time, their military role continued to evolve, and unlike most medieval forces, which were temporary and tied to specific campaigns, the Templars maintained a permanent presence, constantly training, constantly prepared, and always active. Their approach to warfare emphasized discipline above all else. While many knights fought for individual glory, the Templars fought as a unit, maintaining formation, following orders strictly, and coordinating their actions in ways that made them far more effective on the battlefield. Their heavy cavalry charges became one of the most feared tactics of the time, not because they were chaotic, but because they were controlled. When they advanced, they did so together, with precision, turning what was often an unorganized rush in medieval battles into something closer to a unified Udara force that could break enemy lines. Their equipment was standardized, their training consistent, and their identity clear. The white mantle marked with a red cross made them instantly recognizable, both to allies who relied on them and to enemies who learned to fear them. But their strength was not just in open battle. It was also in their ability to adapt, because much of their work involved smaller-scale operations, escorting pilgrims, guarding routes, responding quickly to threats, and maintaining a constant presence in regions where traditional armies could not remain. They built and maintained fortifications across the Holy Land, castles that served as defensive points, supply centers, and symbols of control, allowing them to hold territory even when outnumbered. And yet, despite all this growth, all this power, all this influence, the Templars remained bound by their original vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience, at least in principle. And this created a contrast that defined them. Because while the order itself became wealthy, the individual members were expected to live without personal wealth, serving something larger than themselves. This balance between power and discipline, between wealth and renunciation, was part of what made the Templars so unique and so effective. But it also created tensions, both internally and externally, because not everyone viewed their rise with admiration. As their influence expanded, so did the attention they attracted, from rulers who relied on them, from clergy who questioned their privileges, and from rivals who saw in them not just allies, but competition. And in a world where power was rarely left unchallenged, this growing presence would eventually bring consequences. Because the same system that allowed the Templars to rise would one day make them a target. By the 12th and early 13th centuries, the Templars had become something almost unrecognizable from the small band of knights that left France decades earlier. Their castles, estates, and fortifications stretched from Portugal and Spain to the edges of the Holy Land, and their wealth was legendary. Kings and nobles trusted them with treasure, rulers borrowed from them, and even popes leaned on them to fund wars and crusades. Yet with all their influence came complications. The very network that made them powerful, commanderies across Europe, centralized wealth, and direct access to rulers also created envy. Monarchs, always in need of funds, began to see the Templars not just as allies, but as a convenient source of untapped resources. Church leaders, while publicly supportive, sometimes questioned how a military religious order could amass such riches without apparent accountability. Internally, the Templars faced the strain of maintaining vows in a world increasingly defined by politics and wealth. Individual knights were supposed to live simply, but some began to chafe under the weight of administrative duties and the luxurious trappings of the order's infrastructure. Not all members were willing to reconcile ascetic life with the reality of managing empires of land and gold. Meanwhile, their enemies watched. Muslim forces in the Holy Land, increasingly organized under leaders like Sultan Saladin, noted that the Templars' discipline and fortress networks were formidable, but their European rivals took notice too. Jealous nobles and ambitious kings saw opportunity in the order's wealth, imagining ways to bend or break them if the right moment arose. The tension was subtle at first. Hints of suspicion in correspondence, quiet complaints about favoritism in papal decrees, minor disputes over lands. But every empire, no matter how disciplined, has pressure points. The Templars' visibility, their exceptional privileges, and their accumulation of power planted seeds for conflict that were waiting for a spark. This period also saw a shift in the type of wars the Templars fought. Large-scale crusades became fewer, and the need for permanent garrisons, convoys, and financial oversight grew. They became administrators, bankers, strategists, and soldiers all at once, stretching the order to its limits. Yet, even under strain, they remained effective. Pilgrims traveled more safely, castles held longer, and armies could move farther with Templar support. But as the order grew, so too did myths and rumors. Stories circulated about secret knowledge, strange rituals, and hidden treasures. Some were innocent exaggerations, others were deliberate slanders, but together they shaped perception. In a world where superstition mingled with politics, even the most disciplined order could be vulnerable to slander and suspicion. By the time the 14th century dawned, the Templars were no longer just a fighting force. They were a symbol of both fear and aspiration. Their power could protect kingdoms, enrich allies, and reshape landscapes. But that very power also made them a target for those who coveted, envied, or mistrusted them. The stage was set. Their rise had been meteoric, but history rarely allows empires to exist unchallenged. And soon, the combination of wealth, secrecy, and political intrigue would bring about one of the most dramatic downfalls in medieval history. By the early 1300s, the Templars' extraordinary rise had made them nearly untouchable, or so it seemed. Across Europe, they were landowners, bankers, military strategists, and advisors to kings. Yet the very privileges that elevated them also painted a target on their backs. An entity, country, France, country in Europe. King Philip IV faced enormous debts from wars and court extravagance. The Templars' wealth was legendary, their secretive banking network unmatched. Philip saw a solution. By accusing the Templars of heresy, blasphemy, and scandalous practices, he could seize their assets and eliminate a political rival under the guise of piety. In 1307, knights across France were arrested simultaneously, tortured into confessions, and humiliated publicly. The Pope, Clement V, pressured by Philip, eventually disbanded the order in 1312. Many Templars were executed, others imprisoned, and their treasures absorbed by monarchs or the church. Yet the story didn't end with death and confiscation. Legends of hidden Templar wealth, secret codes, and undiscovered knowledge took root. Scholars, treasure hunters, and storytellers wove tales that spanned centuries. The Templars, once visible as disciplined warriors, became almost mythic, symbols of lost power, hidden truths, and the fragility of even the most disciplined institutions. Their fall illustrates a timeless lesson. Extraordinary success in one era can become vulnerability in the next. Orders, kingdoms, and individuals who accumulate great influence inevitably encounter envy, fear, and the consequences of secrecy. The Templars' discipline, while unmatched in war, could not protect them from the politics of kings and popes. From here, history naturally flows into the story of another organization that rose in the shadows of empires, blending secrecy, wealth, and influence, but in a very different era. Just as the Templars accumulated knowledge, treasures, and networks across Europe and the Holy Land, later secret societies and revolutionary groups, like the Freemasons and early European intelligence networks, used information, alliances, and careful strategy to exert power quietly. Both stories share common threads: discipline, secrecy, influence, and the constant tension between ambition and morality. Where the Templars fell under the weight of external politics and suspicion, these later groups learned from history, adapting secrecy and symbolism to survive in times of scrutiny. This connection invites reflection. The patterns of power, ambition, and downfall are not isolated in time. Medieval knights and secret societies centuries later both navigated the delicate balance between visibility and shadow, wealth and suspicion, duty and survival. The Templar story is not just a tale of war and faith. It's a bridge to understanding the mechanics of influence in all eras, hinting at how ideas, secrecy, and strategy shape history long after swords have been sheathed. The Templars' sudden downfall left Europe with a lingering question. How could such a disciplined and powerful organization be undone so completely? Yet, while the Templars' physical presence vanished, their methods, networks, and legends persisted. Wealth hidden, alliances forged, and knowledge preserved did not die with the last torch of the order. It merely went underground. Centuries later, in the late 16th and 17th centuries, a new type of organization began to rise from the remnants of medieval structures: the Freemasons. Unlike knights bound to a battlefield and a religious code, Freemasons were bound by secrecy, symbols, and the careful cultivation of influence. They were builders, scholars, merchants, and philosophers, spreading across Europe at a time when kings and empires waged wars for both territory and ideas. There is an undeniable continuity here. Both the Templars and the Freemasons relied on networks that spanned regions. Both cultivated an image of discipline and ritual. Both dealt in knowledge, one through military and financial strategy, the other through architecture, philosophy, and coded symbolism. The fall of the Templars served as a cautionary tale. Power without subtlety could be crushed. The Freemasons, perhaps unconsciously, learned from that lesson, embedding secrecy into the very foundations of their organization. While the Templars had fought in armor and on horseback, the Freemasons wielded influence through ideas, connections, and social capital. Royal courts, universities, and emerging capitalist centers became arenas of subtle power struggles. Initiates shared coded symbols and rituals, ensuring that knowledge and allegiance remained within a group. In many ways, they became modern heirs of the Templars' philosophy, a belief in discipline, strategy, and the potential of human organization, but adapted for an age of ink, paper, and influence rather than swords and shields. Yet the parallels go even deeper. Across centuries, stories circulated of Templar treasures and secrets, maps, manuscripts, sacred relics, and some legends suggested these were quietly absorbed into new networks of secret societies. Historians debate the truth of such claims, but the narrative is powerful. The fall of one organization gave birth to ideas that would influence the next. What had been public valor and military might transformed into private knowledge and symbolic influence. Where the Templars had operated under divine authority and papal blessing, the Freemasons operated under philosophical and moral authority, carefully avoiding political overreach, learning the Templars' fatal mistake. In this sense, the story of the Templars is not just an end. It is the seed of modern secrecy and strategic networks. From the ruins of medieval Europe, these patterns of influence quietly took root, shaping revolutions, Enlightenment thought, and even the politics of emerging nations. The narrative moves seamlessly from swords to symbols, from public acts to private strategy, showing a continuum of human ambition, secrecy, and resilience. And so, as the Templars faded into legend, the next chapter of history began quietly. Networks that wielded influence without revealing themselves, institutions that preserved knowledge across generations, and societies that understood the fine balance between visibility and survival. The echoes of the Templars' discipline could be felt in these later movements, guiding them subtly, shaping decisions, and reminding the ambitious that the line between greatness and destruction is razor thin. By the early 18th century, the Freemasons had transformed from scattered lodges into a formidable web of influence across Europe. In London, Paris, and Edinburgh, secret lodges became hubs for intellectual exchange, philosophical debate, and quiet networking among elites. Unlike the Templars, whose power relied on wealth and armies, the Freemasons wielded the subtler weapons of persuasion, knowledge, and strategic alliances. Their rituals, often misunderstood by outsiders, created bonds of loyalty stronger than any public oath. These bonds would quietly shape some of the most pivotal moments in European history. In France, lodges became meeting points for thinkers who would inspire the Enlightenment, promoting ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Philosophers, politicians, and wealthy patrons exchanged ideas under the cover of secrecy, laying groundwork for revolutions that would shake monarchies to their core. In England and Scotland, Masonic networks helped spread scientific ideas, new approaches to governance, and global trade strategies. The Templars' legacy was clear in every maneuver. The Freemasons had learned the harsh lesson of visibility. To survive, power must often operate in shadows. Whereas the Templars were hunted openly by kings and popes, the Freemasons moved discreetly, influencing events from behind the curtain. In this way, they became the invisible hands of history, shaping policies, inspiring reforms, and connecting leaders who would never publicly admit their shared allegiance. Yet with influence came risk. Rumors of secret plots, coded messages, and hidden agendas swirled around Freemasonry, echoing the whispers that had haunted the Templars. Governments were wary. The Catholic Church still viewed them with suspicion, remembering the Templars' dramatic fall. And so the Freemasons perfected the art of appearing innocuous while quietly steering ideas, funding projects, and mentoring the next generation of thinkers and leaders. Across the Atlantic, these networks began to touch the New World. Freemason lodges in colonial cities became centers where revolutionary ideas took root. Leaders of independence movements studied principles discussed in European lodges, blending ideals of freedom, strategy, and civic responsibility. Here, the invisible thread spun centuries earlier by the Templars, discipline, secrecy, and strategic foresight, found a new life in shaping nations. The narrative reveals a pattern. From knights on horseback to scholars in lodges, the quest for influence remained constant. Only the methods evolved. Each secret society, each network, learned from the mistakes and successes of its predecessors. The Templars' downfall became a blueprint for survival and secrecy. The Freemasons' quiet power became a model for shaping history without drawing the sword. And those who inherited these lessons would go on to influence revolutions, governments, and the very ideas that define modern civilization. As the 17th century progressed, the Freemasons' influence quietly intertwined with the ambitions of the great empires of Europe. While kings and sultans clashed over land, trade, and dynastic claims, the lodges operated behind the scenes, shaping the strategies and alliances that would determine the fate of continents. In London, Paris, and Vienna, Masonic members, often diplomats, military officers, and financiers, exchanged information and subtly guided decisions that could tilt wars without a single sword being drawn. In the Ottoman Empire, far from the lodges of Western Europe, a similar principle emerged through secret councils of scholars and military advisors who preserved knowledge, advised rulers, and monitored the ambitions of neighboring states. Though not Masonic in name, these networks mirrored the Templar and Freemason philosophy. influence through information, loyalty, and strategic positioning. The lesson of discretion was clear. Visible power invited envy and destruction. The Habsburgs, the Sun King of France, and the sprawling Russian Tsardom each relied on intricate webs of spies, envoys, and secret alliances. European wars of succession, religious conflicts, and territorial expansion were not just fought on battlefields. They were decided in whispered councils, letters exchanged under coded ciphers, and carefully orchestrated marriages that united or divided dynasties. Here again, the subtle legacy of the Templars persisted. The most enduring power was the one wielded quietly, through networks that outlasted any army. In the Indian subcontinent, the Mughal Empire experienced a similar interplay of intrigue and strategy. Advisors, generals, and nobles maneuvered in shadows, securing influence over the emperor's decisions. Alliances shifted, rebellions were suppressed, and regions rose and fell in accordance with both military might and the unseen hand of political manipulation. This mirrored the European pattern. Empires rose not only by conquest, but through careful cultivation of loyalty, intelligence, and the strategic guidance of those who operated beyond public view. Meanwhile, the Dutch and Portuguese trading empires expanded across Asia and Africa. Here, merchants and navigators became quasi-political agents, wielding knowledge of distant lands as their weapon. Trade routes, fortifications, and diplomatic relations were carefully managed to benefit those with the foresight to control the flow of information, a distinctly Templar-inspired strategy of influence without overt domination. Across continents, a pattern became clear. Empires might wage open wars, but the real battles for survival, wealth, and influence were often invisible. In every court, council, and lodge, the lessons of secrecy, discipline, and foresight persisted. The Templars' dramatic fall centuries earlier had shown the danger of being too openly powerful. The Freemasons and their ideological cousins adapted this wisdom, ensuring that those who shaped history could do so without exposing themselves to sudden destruction. By tracing these subtle currents, one sees the skeleton beneath the flesh of empires. The wars, the kings, the battles. They're the visible outcomes of invisible forces quietly guiding the fates of nations. From the Habsburgs to the Mughals, from the Dutch East India Company to the French crown, every empire unknowingly danced to the rhythm of networks forged in secrecy, continuity, and strategic cunning. The 17th century became a stage for the grandest contest between empires the world had yet seen. On the European continent, the Habsburgs and the Ottomans clashed repeatedly, their conflicts not just about borders, but about the very balance of power. Vienna stood as the fulcrum of this struggle. Every decision within its walls, alliances, supply lines, troop movements, carried the weight of centuries of ambition. Behind the obvious military campaigns, subtle forces operated. Envoys bearing secret instructions, financiers shifting resources, and advisors molding the decisions of kings, often guided by the same principles that had once defined Templar strategy. Across the Indian Ocean, the Mughal Empire faced its own challenges as Portuguese, Dutch, and later British traders sought to establish footholds on its coasts. Forts rose along the shores, fleets clashed in shadowy waters, and secret negotiations determined who controlled the flow of spices, textiles, and wealth. Like the European powers, the Mughals relied on trusted advisors and intelligence networks to anticipate threats, maintain stability, and assert influence without overextending their authority. In both East and West, the lesson was identical. True power was measured not merely by armies, but by the ability to foresee, manipulate, and outmaneuver rivals quietly. Meanwhile, in France, the Sun King Louis XIV was consolidating authority through both grandeur and subtle intrigue. The courts of Versailles were a theater where diplomacy, marriage alliances, and the art of perception shaped policy as much as cannons and battalions. Courtiers competed not just for favor, but for the ability to control the flow of information, a silent war of influence that mirrored the hidden councils of the Ottoman viziers or the Mughal nobles. Across Europe, secrecy, strategy, and discretion became as vital as gold, grain, or guns. Even the maritime empires, Spain, Portugal, the Dutch Republic, and England, relied on invisible networks. Knowledge of winds, currents, and distant ports was as powerful as any sword. Merchants, explorers, and spies often dictated the success of empires far more than battlefield valor. The invisible hand of intelligence, diplomacy, and calculated influence shaped outcomes in ways the public never saw, allowing empires to expand and endure beyond what armies alone could achieve. Across continents, one truth endured. Wars were fought openly, but history was often written in the shadows. Empires rose and fell not solely through conquest, but through unseen threads of power woven by those who understood that the most enduring control is quiet, invisible, and patient. The echoes of Templar strategy, preserved and adapted by networks like the Freemasons, resonated through every court, council, and battlefield, ensuring that history's victors often wielded influence in ways invisible to the masses. The stage was now set for a new era of interconnected empires. Europe, the Ottoman lands, India, and maritime powers, each aware that survival and dominance depended as much on secrecy and foresight as on cannons and swords. The patterns of influence that had quietly guided centuries would continue, bridging distant lands and diverse cultures, shaping the fate of humanity long before the modern world emerged. As the 17th century unfolded, the world was a chessboard of colossal ambition. In Europe, the struggle between empires reached unprecedented complexity. The Habsburgs, determined to preserve their sprawling territories from the encroachment of France, relied on alliances that stretched from the icy Baltic to the warm banks of the Danube. Every march of an army, every fortification erected, and every treaty signed was a calculated move in a centuries-long game of survival and influence. Ambassadors traveled secretly under the cover of night. Letters carried encrypted instructions, and entire campaigns depended on intelligence so subtle that victory often came before a single sword was drawn. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire, though outwardly engaged in open campaigns along its borders, cultivated an empire within an empire. Viziers, generals, and provincial governors wielded power in layers, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, but always under the watchful eye of the Sultan. Their intelligence networks penetrated Europe, sending spies disguised as merchants, scholars, or pilgrims, all tasked with understanding intentions, ambitions, and weaknesses. The Ottomans understood that the art of control was not merely territorial. It was psychological, subtle, and invisible. Half a world away, the Mughal Empire in India balanced monumental wealth with constant internal and external pressure. Emperors like Aurangzeb maintained absolute authority, while regional governors managed vast provinces, each a microcosm of loyalty and dissent. Merchants from Persia, Arabia, and Europe flooded the ports with goods, gold, and information. The coastal cities became silent theaters of intrigue, where alliances were brokered over cups of spiced tea, and wars were won or lost as much in whispers and letters as on the battlefield. The empire's strength relied on the precision of administration and the intelligence of its inner circle, a pattern mirrored in every great empire, east and west. On the seas, European maritime powers, Spain, Portugal, the Dutch, and England, engaged in a subtler form of conquest. The oceans were not just highways of trade, but avenues of espionage and influence. Maps were guarded secrets, navigational knowledge a commodity more valuable than silver. Fleets moved not merely to seize ports, but to control the invisible threads that connected wealth, information, and power. A single well-placed ship or a timely intelligence leak could shift the balance of entire regions, demonstrating that empires thrived not only through armies, but through foresight, strategy, and cunning. Even within seemingly peaceful courts, the battle for dominance never ceased. Louis Xivie's Versailles was a masterclass in manipulation. Every ballroom, every garden pathway, Every favor granted or withheld was part of a grander design to control the flow of influence. Courtiers, nobles, and ambassadors played an endless game of observation and persuasion, understanding that power could often be more effectively wielded through perception than force. These silent, elegant manipulations mirrored the secret councils of the Ottomans and the strategic communications of the Mughals, a testament to the universality of invisible control. The era's most powerful empires all shared a hidden truth. The greatest victories were not those won by swords and cannons, but by subtle networks of knowledge, loyalty, and manipulation. Battles could decide the fates of kings and generals, but empires endured when the minds behind them anticipated threats, guided decisions, and influenced rivals long before they could act. Across continents, the invisible hand of strategy connected distant lands, forging a web of influence that would ripple through generations. And it was within these invisible threads that the next great saga was quietly forming. As Europe, Asia, and the Middle East consolidated power, new forces stirred at the edges. Ambitious generals, emerging maritime empires, and hidden societies that had survived centuries of change. Their stories were separate yet intertwined, the outcomes of one empire's decisions subtly shaping the rise of another. The stage was set to move from the age of long-established empires into the era of global connections, conquests, and revelations, where one empire's fall would become another's opportunity, and the strategies of centuries past would echo in new forms. This was not yet the modern world. This was the age where empires still defined history, where knowledge was power, secrecy was survival, and strategy was the invisible ruler of men's fates. From these shadows, the next epic was poised to emerge, a tale of new empires, bold explorers, and the quiet but unstoppable rise of forces that would eventually bind continents together. While the great empires of Europe, the Ottoman lands, and the Mughal courts wove their intricate webs of control, other corners of the world were quietly preparing their own chapters in history. In Central Asia, the vast steppes, once ruled by the thunderous armies of the Mongols, had stabilized into a patchwork of khanates. These khanates were smaller than the unified empire of Genghis Khan, yet their leaders were shrewd, maintaining power through alliances, marriages, and the ever-present threat of swift cavalry raids. The successors of the Mongols were no longer conquerors of continents, but masters of mobility and intelligence. Every horseman, every messenger across the endless plains, carried not only orders but secrets, ensuring that even the most distant territories remained connected to the heartbeat of the Khanate. Far to the east, in the lands of the rising Qing, the Manchu rulers were consolidating power over China. The Ming dynasty's fall had left a vacuum, and the Qing seized it with meticulous calculation. Their armies were disciplined, their bureaucracy efficient, and their spies everywhere. Scholars, merchants, and generals alike played roles in an intricate system where information flowed as carefully as rivers. The emperors understood that longevity depended less on brute force than on precision, on understanding rivals before rivals could act, and on absorbing knowledge from both the conquered and the strangers who dared enter their lands. Meanwhile, in the islands of Southeast Asia, the spice trade continued to shape power in subtle yet profound ways. Local sultans and chiefs navigated the presence of European traders, welcoming their silver while keeping tight control over their resources. Ports became centers not only of commerce, but of diplomacy and espionage. Ships from the Dutch East India Company, Portugal, and England carried more than goods. They carried intelligence, alliances, and ambitions that could tip the balance of power in distant courts. The leaders who understood the invisible flow of these forces could elevate small kingdoms into regional powers, while those who underestimated it vanished quietly into obscurity. The Middle East, too, remained a theater of intricate maneuvering. While the Ottomans retained their dominance, the Safavid Empire in Persia quietly nurtured its own networks of influence. Shura clerics, provincial governors, and merchants worked together to preserve sovereignty and culture in a world where every border was contested. Like the Ottoman Empire, survival depended on blending visibility and invisibility, displaying strength where necessary while concealing true intentions. It was an era where diplomacy was a battlefield and patience a weapon. Across all these regions, one truth became increasingly clear. The fate of empires was no longer decided solely by armies or riches. It was determined by information, networks, and foresight. The armies of old could still conquer, but the new masters would be those who read the world's currents like a map, anticipating storms, navigating alliances, and striking with precision when the moment arrived. Every victory was a thread in a web, every failure a cautionary tale for the next generation. As centuries of empire building stretched onward, these emerging powers began to intersect. The knowledge of one empire often became the opportunity for another. Maps drawn in Europe reached the ports of Asia. Traders whispered tales from distant lands. Couriers carried not only goods but secrets and strategies. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world began to shrink. Not through technology, but through the invisible flow of information and ambition. The great empires of the past were still powerful, yet new forces were rising in ways that would eventually challenge the old hierarchies. And so, from the shadow of the old empires, a new stage was being set. The Khanates, the Qing, the Southeast Asian sultanates, and the Persian courts were all actors in a drama that would stretch across continents. Their stories were separate, yet destined to intertwine. The patterns of power, strategy, and influence learned over centuries would now play out in new ways, connecting lands that had once seemed unreachable. The invisible threads of history were pulling tighter, weaving together a future in which every empire's decision, no matter how small, would echo across the world. The next saga was quietly approaching, a story of explorers, traders, and empires that would expand beyond borders, yet remain deeply tied to the strategies and cunning of the rulers who came before them. The stage was ready, the players were in motion, and the world was about to feel the ripple effects of centuries of ambition. As the 17th century progressed, the web of connections between the great and emerging empires became impossible to ignore. On the steppes of Central Asia, the Khanates no longer acted in isolation. Caravan routes, once lifelines of nomadic survival, had grown into arteries of commerce and intelligence. Merchants carried silks, spices, and silver, but also rumors of distant courts, shifting alliances, and the movements of armies. Khanates began to send envoys far beyond their borders, not only to secure trade, but to negotiate subtle power arrangements. The balance of influence was no longer purely military. A clever envoy could achieve in words what a cavalry charge might fail to do in battle. To the east, the Qing dynasty observed these shifts carefully. While consolidating control over the Chinese heartland, they began sending emissaries into Mongolia, Tibet, and the southwestern frontier. The empire understood that distant powers were more than neighbors. They were potential threats, allies, and mirrors of their own ambitions. Scholars and diplomats compiled extensive records of every Khanate's leadership, economy, and military capacity, creating a network of intelligence that rivaled any European spy system of the time. Meanwhile, military innovation from the steppes, light cavalry tactics, rapid mobilization, and sophisticated logistics were studied and adapted. Knowledge, more than territory, was becoming the currency of power. In Southeast Asia, the sultanates grew accustomed to the ever-present European fleets. The Portuguese had long dominated trade routes, but the Dutch and the British were relentless competitors, sending not only ships but emissaries and spies. Local rulers navigated these interactions with careful calculation. They welcomed the silver that came from trade, but kept a wary eye on foreign ambitions. Every port city became a miniature chessboard, where merchants, soldiers, and diplomats played moves that could tip the balance of regional influence. Alliances shifted, sometimes overnight, based on the fortunes of distant empires and the shifting prices of spices, silk, and porcelain. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the Ottomans and the Safavids continued their intricate dance. Centuries-old enmity persisted, but it was tempered by necessity. The Ottoman Empire relied on trade across the Mediterranean and into Europe, while the Safavids needed access to ports and markets to sustain their economy. Diplomats traveled dangerous routes, carrying letters encrypted with subtle codes, negotiating terms that could prevent war or ignite it. Both empires understood that the survival of their states depended on a delicate balance, showing strength to rivals while avoiding reckless conflict that could weaken them against other powers emerging on the horizon. Across these regions, one subtle pattern emerged. Empires were beginning to influence one another indirectly. Knowledge, technology, and culture flowed along trade routes, crossing borders as surely as armies did. A military innovation in the steppes might inspire a reform in Qing China. A new navigational map from Europe could shift the strategy of a Southeast Asian sultanate. Even distant conflicts became cautionary tales. The rise or fall of one empire could reshape the ambitions of another. This was a world in which empires were learning to see beyond their immediate horizons. They understood that survival depended not just on conquest, but on foresight, diplomacy, and adaptability. The players were changing, the stakes were rising, and the stage was set for encounters that would link continents in ways never seen before. Trade caravans, diplomatic missions, and the subtle spread of ideas had created invisible bridges between civilizations, bridges that could carry opportunity or disaster, depending on who crossed them first. And so, the world's old and new powers continued their careful advance. Every decision, every alliance, and every negotiation had the potential to ripple outward, influencing not only their own destiny, but the fate of empires far beyond their sight. The great empires of the past remained dominant, yet the seeds of future global interconnection were being sown, a network that would eventually redefine the shape of power across the continents. As the 17th century matured, the intricate web of empires became ever more entangled. Central Asia's Khanates, long accustomed to life on the steppe, had begun forming alliances not only with one another, but with distant powers they had never met face to face. Envoys carried gifts of horses, silk, and precious stones across deserts and mountains, each item a subtle message of respect, intimidation, or alliance. Knowledge of foreign military tactics was prized as highly as gold, and some khans began recruiting foreign advisors to teach their warriors new methods of siegecraft, cavalry maneuvering, and firearms usage. The steppe was no longer an isolated world. It had become a chessboard where distant kings and emperors played without leaving their thrones. To the east, the Qing dynasty consolidated its rule over China with both steel and intellect. Fortresses and garrisons marked strategic locations, but the most powerful weapon of all was bureaucracy. Officials, meticulously trained, maintained records of every province, every trade transaction, and every foreign envoy. The empire's scholars studied the movements of nomadic leaders, European traders, and even the whispers of rebellions within Tibet and the southwestern frontier. In time, the Qing realized that the mastery of information could be as decisive as mastery of armies. The empire's influence began to extend through networks of commerce, diplomacy, and cultural exchange, weaving a web that would soon touch the distant sultanates and khanates. Southeast Asia's maritime sultanates were learning similar lessons, though on turbulent seas. The Portuguese, Dutch, and English fleets were constant presences, sometimes rivals, sometimes brokers of profit. Sultanates had to navigate these waters with skill and cunning, negotiating treaties that could secure their ports and monopolize trade routes, all while preparing for potential attacks. Merchants became as powerful as military commanders, their decisions on pricing, routes, and alliances often determining whether a city thrived or fell into decline. Meanwhile, knowledge of foreign weapons, shipbuilding techniques, and navigation slowly diffused into local arsenals, creating a subtle arms race across the islands. In the Middle East, the Ottomans and Safavids maintained their centuries-old rivalry, tempered by pragmatism. Battles still erupted, but diplomacy was equally relentless. Envoys traveled across deserts and rivers, carrying messages encrypted with layers of meaning, offering gifts of horses, spices, or rare manuscripts. Each interaction was a test, a show of loyalty, strength, or cunning. Both empires realized that a poorly judged move could spark war that would invite external powers to intervene. And as news of distant events, European conflicts, Indian subcontinent upheavals, and steppe maneuvers reached their courts, they began adjusting their strategies to account for threats far beyond their traditional borders. Meanwhile, trade, migration, and warfare began producing unforeseen cultural connections. Military techniques, architectural styles, and even cuisine traveled across continents. A Khanate's cavalry innovations might influence Qing strategies. Ottoman cannon designs could inspire Safavid defenses. Chinese ceramics became coveted treasures in Southeast Asian courts, influencing local artistic styles. The world was increasingly interconnected, even before formal alliances were made. Every shipment of silk, every caravan of horses, every envoy sent across mountains created threads linking societies that centuries before would have remained isolated. Amid this growing interconnectedness, the empire's rulers understood that power was no longer simply about conquest. It was about foresight, intelligence, and adaptability. Some leaders used diplomacy to expand influence without drawing swords, while others experimented with combining foreign technologies with native strengths. They recognized that empires could rise or fall not only because of battles won or lost, but because of knowledge gained, alliances forged, and subtle strategies executed with patience over decades. And so, the stage was set for a new age of confrontation and connection. The great empires of the past, still dominant, were beginning to sense the emergence of distant powers. The world was shifting, its future written not just in swords and armies, but in the invisible currents of trade, diplomacy, and ideas that flowed from one empire to another, binding them into a vast, interwoven tapestry of ambition, rivalry, and opportunity. By the early decades of the 17th century, the world of empires had reached a complexity unseen in earlier centuries. Across the vast plains of Central Asia, the Khanates continued their intricate dance of diplomacy, conquest, and survival. These were not mere isolated steppe warriors. They were the inheritors of centuries of military innovation, who had learned to combine the speed of cavalry with the brute force of siege engines. And now they experimented with the firearms brought by wandering merchants and mercenaries from the West. Envoys traveled the Silk Roads in endless streams, carrying gifts of camels, rare textiles, horses, and sometimes humans, slaves, or diplomats, in a continuous exchange of trust, intimidation, and prestige. The Kazakh Khans, in particular, were adept at using intelligence as a weapon. Their spies penetrated not only rival Khanates, but even the edges of the Qing Empire and distant Russian principalities. Reports of troop movements, harvest yields, alliances, and betrayals were collected meticulously, bound into scrolls that could fill a room. Military leaders pored over these intelligence reports before engaging in any campaign, understanding that victory was not only a matter of force but of foresight. Cavalry units trained to strike fast and disappear like ghosts across the steppe, sometimes never leaving evidence of their passage beyond broken fences and startled villagers. Meanwhile, the Qing dynasty, under the steady hand of its emperors, began consolidating its territories in ways that few other empires had dared. Military campaigns in the northern frontier subdued nomadic tribes, while administrative reforms in the south strengthened control over previously semi-independent regions. The dynasty invested heavily in infrastructure, roads, garrisons, watchtowers, and postal relay systems that allowed messages to travel faster than ever before. Scholars in the imperial court studied foreign lands, attempting to predict the movements of distant powers. Cartographers created maps of neighboring khanates, the Russian principalities, and even European trade ports. These maps were not merely decorative. They were instruments of empire, tools to project influence and anticipate threats. In the vast reaches of the Indian subcontinent, the Mughal Empire reached a delicate equilibrium of power. The emperors relied on a combination of military might, administrative skill, and cultural patronage to maintain control over an enormous and diverse population. Elite cavalry and infantry units were drilled in new formations inspired by Persian and Central Asian tactics, while naval forces along the western and eastern coasts protected trade and enforced tribute. The empire's bureaucrats meticulously recorded taxation, trade, population, and agricultural output, using information to anticipate and preempt uprisings. Trade caravans moved along the Grand Trunk Road in coastal ports, linking distant cities like Agra, Surat, and Dhaka, while European merchants quietly inserted themselves into these networks, offering silver, firearms, and textiles in exchange for spices, textiles, and precious stones. Southeast Asia remained a theater of constant adaptation. The maritime sultanates of Malacca, Johor, Aceh, and Makassar faced not only European traders, but also pirates, local rivals, and inland kingdoms. Control of the seas meant control of wealth and survival. Sultanates competed to acquire foreign shipbuilding techniques, cannons, and navigational instruments. Diplomacy was as lethal as warfare. Treaties were carefully crafted, often containing hidden clauses designed to betray a rival at the right moment. Cities flourished where trade was secure. Ports decayed where power was uncertain. Merchants acted as de facto diplomats, their decisions guiding the fate of empires as much as any sword or cannon. In the Middle East, the age-old rivalry between the Ottomans and Safavids intensified as both powers expanded influence through warfare, religion, and diplomacy. The Ottoman Empire, master of both European and Asian theaters, had perfected a system of provincial governance that allowed for rapid mobilization of armies and resources. The Janissaries remained elite shock troops, disciplined, loyal, and feared across the empire. Safavid Persia, in contrast, relied on the strategic brilliance of its rulers, the loyalty of tribal confederations, and the influx of firearms technology. Espionage was rampant. Spies moved across deserts and mountains, smuggling information to the highest bidders, often turning one city against another through subtle manipulations. Treaties were broken as often as they were signed, yet the careful balance of power prevented either empire from achieving complete dominance. Europe, meanwhile, was entering a period of upheaval that would soon ripple outward. The 30 Years' War was raging, but even distant empires paid attention. Merchants and envoys carried news of battles, sieges, and political marriages across continents. European innovations in artillery, fortification, and shipbuilding did not remain confined to the continent. They traveled through trade and conquest, gradually influencing the tactics and technology of Asian and Middle Eastern powers. For instance, Safavid engineers studied European artillery designs, while Ottoman admirals experimented with shipbuilding techniques observed in Venetian ports. Knowledge of distant conflicts influenced decisions in Central Asia, India, and the Far East, often in unexpected ways. Across these empires, trade networks became arteries of influence and power. The Silk Road, maritime passages of Southeast Asia, and the Indian Ocean trade routes were more than economic conduits. They were lifelines for intelligence, culture, and technology. Ideas, inventions, and even disease moved along these routes with as much consequence as armies. A Khan in Central Asia might learn of European firearms through merchants before ever seeing a European soldier. A Mughal emperor might adopt Persian administrative techniques to streamline revenue collection. A sultan in Malacca might use Chinese nautical charts to outmaneuver rivals at sea. The empires were no longer isolated. They were interwoven into a global lattice of power, opportunity, and risk. Amid all this, small but pivotal decisions shaped the fate of empires. A Persian engineer might design a new type of cannon that turns the tide in a siege. A Central Asian caravan leader might betray a rival khanate for a better deal. A Mughal bureaucrat might record a subtle discrepancy in tax collection that reveals an insurrection before it erupts. Every human action, no matter how small, became a thread in a larger tapestry of empire. The great rulers understood this, and many began to cultivate networks of scholars, spies, merchants, and generals who could act autonomously yet align with imperial strategy. As the decades unfolded, new powers emerged from these networks of interaction. A minor khanate could rise to prominence through savvy alliances and innovative tactics. Coastal sultanates could leverage European trade to enrich themselves and gain strategic leverage over inland rivals. The Qing dynasty could use its bureaucratic mastery to anticipate rebellion before it occurred, consolidating vast territories without firing a single arrow. Empires learned that survival required adaptation as much as strength, innovation as much as conquest. And yet, despite the growing interconnection, the empires remained deeply human in their struggles. Greed, ambition, pride, fear, and loyalty shaped decisions as much as strategy and technology. Leaders made miscalculations, alliances faltered, and wars erupted unexpectedly. Cultural exchange occurred not only through diplomacy and trade, but also through conquest, migration, and even captivity. Art, literature, music, and religion flowed across borders, creating a shared yet contested cultural space. A Persian poet might find inspiration in Chinese landscape paintings. A Central Asian caravan leader might adopt Ottoman military formations. A Southeast Asian ruler might decorate his palace with Mughal motifs. This period of history, stretching across continents, demonstrated a single truth. The world of empires was a vast, interwoven web where no power existed in isolation. Every decision, every innovation, every betrayal or alliance created ripples that traveled far and wide. The stage was being set for the next great upheavals. Wars that would redraw borders, trade conflicts that would shift economic power, and cultural movements that would influence generations. The interconnectedness of empires had reached a tipping point, where the actions of one could profoundly affect the destinies of many. And it was here, amid the bustling courts, sprawling battlefields, and vibrant markets, that the next story was quietly preparing itself. A tale of rivalry, ambition, and transformation, in which distant empires would confront one another not merely for territory or wealth, but for influence over the very ideas and technologies that defined the age. The threads of the past were converging with the currents of the future. From the windswept steppes of Central Asia to the fortified cities of the Qing, from the coasts of Malacca to the imperial courts of Persia and India, a new era was approaching. One in which connections forged through trade, war, and diplomacy would determine who rose and who fell. And within this era, stories would unfold that were as intimate as they were grand, as human as they were imperial. The next part will follow a major military and diplomatic convergence, where several of these empires interact directly, through a campaign, trade conflict, or alliance, creating a bridge to a new story arc that can continue the epic narrative. The winds over the Central Asian steppes carried more than dust. They carried the promise of war, the whispers of alliances, and the silent footfalls of spies moving beneath the cover of night. Khan Abdur-Rashid of the Kazakh territories, a man both ruthless and cunning, had received intelligence of Qing troop movements along the northern frontier. Scouts reported large encampments, artillery stockpiles, and the strange new formations of infantry trained in European tactics. Abdur-Rashid, knowing the advantage lay not merely in numbers but in foresight, summoned his council of generals, envoys, and cryptographers. Maps of the steppes, hand-drawn and meticulously annotated with every river crossing, passable mountain range, and seasonal wind pattern, were spread across the massive oak table. "We cannot hope to meet them head-on," said General Timurbeck, a veteran of countless skirmishes. "But we can force them into the terrain we know, where cavalry mobility and sudden strikes can offset their firepower." Abdur-Rashid nodded, his eyes scanning the scrolls. and yet we must not act as mere predators. Diplomacy must be our spear as well as our sword. Our southern neighbors, the Mughal provinces, must remain neutral, or better, persuaded to ally. We will offer them silk and horses, promise them stability along their western borders. If they refuse, we strike swiftly, leaving them no choice. Meanwhile, the Qing Emperor Xuanji, aware of Abdur Rashid's reputation, was orchestrating his own strategy. His generals were dispatched to survey the steppes, to map the movements of nomadic tribes, and to prepare the massive logistical network required to sustain an army far from home. Supply caravans moved in disciplined columns, guarded by soldiers and engineers capable of repairing roads, fording rivers, and constructing makeshift fortifications. The emperor's advisors, scholars trained in both Confucian philosophy and military science, debated endlessly over the merits of confrontation versus containment, over the delicate balance of force and restraint. To the west, the Ottoman Empire watched with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The Grand Vizier had received reports that Safavid Persia was quietly seeking alliances with Central Asian Khanates, potentially to counterbalance Ottoman influence in the Caucasus. Ottoman envoys, their robes embroidered with gold, traveled across deserts and mountain passes, negotiating subtle agreements with tribal leaders, offering gifts of cannon, grain, and artisans. Each decision was a chess move in a game that spanned continents. The Ottomans could not intervene directly in Central Asia without risking overextension, but they could manipulate events through diplomacy and selective military aid. In the Mughal courts, Emperor Shah Jahan's advisors debated the potential consequences of choosing sides. The empire's wealth and stability rested on internal harmony, but news from the steppes could not be ignored. Merchants returning from caravan routes spoke of massive armies and fires in distant settlements, of treaties written in secrecy and broken in daylight. Shah Jahan, known for both his patience and his ruthlessness, understood that the world was shifting. Trade and diplomacy are weapons as sharp as any blade, he said to his ministers. If we fail to wield them properly, we risk being crushed between empires far from our walls. Across these theaters, the first cracks in old alliances began to appear. In one Kazakh encampment, a minor Khan expressed dissatisfaction with Abdur Rashid's centralizing policies. Promises of autonomy and shared spoils barely concealed his ambition. Spies from the Qing had infiltrated these camps, posing as traitors and advisors, sending encrypted messages back to Beijing detailing troop dispositions and potential vulnerabilities. Safavid agents, in turn, approached both Kazakh factions and Mughal intermediaries, offering to mediate and secretly sow discord. By mid-autumn, the stage was set. Thousands of troops, cavalry, and artillery units prepared for movement. Kazakh scouts shadowed Qing supply lines, sabotaging river crossings and ambushing stragglers. The Qing responded by reorganizing columns, deploying infantry to guard vital routes, and building fortified outposts at strategic mountain passes. Skirmishes erupted along rivers and plains, each minor clash sending shockwaves through the intelligence networks of every empire involved. The conflict was not merely military, it was cultural and symbolic. Shamans and priests in Kazakh camps invoked ancestral spirits to bless the warriors, while Qing scholars recited Confucian texts before battles, interpreting the movements of stars and omens to predict success. Persian diplomats composed intricate letters filled with poetry and subtle threats, seeking to manipulate outcomes without direct bloodshed. Ottoman observers, though far from the battlefield, analyzed these developments, sending coded dispatches to Constantinople recommending cautious support to whichever side appeared most likely to weaken Safavid influence. One of the decisive confrontations occurred near the Ili River, where a Qing detachment encountered a reinforced Kazakh cavalry corps. The battle unfolded over several days, with the steppes themselves becoming a weapon. Kazakh horsemen lured Qing units into marshes and narrow valleys, where mobility was restricted. Artillery fire, though powerful, was less effective in the uneven terrain. Night attacks, sudden flanking maneuvers, and rapid retreats created chaos. Yet Qing discipline proved formidable. Units held formation under fire, reinforced one another, and constructed temporary fortifications overnight. The clash ended inconclusively, but both sides suffered losses that reshaped subsequent strategies. During this tumult, the Mughal Empire maintained a careful distance, supplying trade caravans with protection and subtly adjusting tax policies to ensure merchants were not disrupted. Safavid Persia, meanwhile, used the chaos to consolidate influence in secondary khanates, offering promises of protection, trade advantages, and military aid. Every action was interdependent. A victory in one valley could ripple across hundreds of miles, altering alliances, emboldening rebels, and forcing recalibrations of strategy in capitals thousands of miles away. As winter approached, the empires faced the logistical reality of sustaining prolonged campaigns across vast, hostile territories. Supply lines were stretched, morale fluctuated, and harsh weather compounded every challenge. Leaders realized that war alone could not guarantee survival or dominance. Diplomacy, intelligence, and subtle manipulation were equally vital. Envoys traveled across snow-covered passes carrying messages that could determine the fate of entire regions. Treaties were drafted with ambiguous clauses, designed to deceive potential enemies while preserving the appearance of legitimacy. Yet even amidst the politics, battles, and intrigue, human stories unfolded. A Kazakh general wrote a letter to his family detailing the hardships and camaraderie of campaign life. A Qing scholar recorded the poetry of soldiers, finding beauty in the midst of chaos. Mughal merchants risked bandits and harsh weather to deliver essential supplies, their actions shaping the course of empires as much as any general. The tapestry of history was being woven not only by kings and emperors, but by ordinary men and women whose choices reverberated far beyond their immediate understanding. By the end of the year, the great empires recognized that this confrontation, though monumental, was not an endpoint. It was a precursor. The steppes of Central Asia had become a testing ground, not only for military might, but for the subtler instruments of power: diplomacy, trade, espionage, and culture. The Qing and Kazakh forces withdrew to regroup, while Safavid Persia and the Ottoman Empire recalibrated their strategies. The Mughal Empire remained a vigilant observer, aware that future developments could either threaten or enrich its dominion. The stage was thus set for the next era of transformation, a period in which empires would confront one another in increasingly direct and sophisticated ways, while the threads of diplomacy, espionage, and trade continued to interweave their destinies. What had begun as isolated conflicts across distant plains had evolved into a web connecting the steppes, deserts, rivers, and seas. Each empire's choices rippled outward, shaping the fates of others, and hinting at the interconnected struggles that would define the next epic. As the first snow fell over the Ili River, a Kazakh horseman paused atop a hill, gazing at the distant Qing encampments. He could not know the full scope of the empire's machinations, nor the consequences of the battles to come. Yet in his eyes, in the actions of soldiers, scholars, merchants, and spies across continents, the pulse of history beat steadily. Empires were alive, interacting, adapting, and the stories that would emerge from these interactions would resonate for generations, bridging the distant past with the next age of power, ambition, and human ingenuity. This part concludes with the battlefield tensions still unresolved, but the interconnection of empires firmly established. The next story can evolve naturally from this point. The Qing and Kazakh conflicts can intersect with Mughal, Safavid, and Ottoman interests, forming the foundation of a new epic saga of empire, culture, and human ambition. The early spring winds across Central Asia carried the scent of thawing rivers, smoke from distant encampments, and the palpable tension of empires on the brink. For years, the steppes had witnessed the collision of Kazakh cavalry, Qing infantry, and the subtle manipulations of Safavid and Ottoman agents. Now, all the threads of power, ambition, and survival were converging into a single, decisive chapter. Khan Abdur-Rashid, seated in his massive tent lined with silks from Bokhara and the hides of steppe horses, studied the latest reports brought by scouts who had traversed frozen rivers and snowbound passes. "The Qing are moving toward the Ili," one officer reported, bowing deeply. "But they are wary. They do not understand these lands as we do. If we act wisely, we can draw them into terrain favorable to us, force them into overextension, and strike decisively." Abdur-Rashid's eyes glinted with calculation. "Then we shall prepare a trap, not just for them, but for all who would see our steppes subdued. Every alliance, every treaty, every envoy will be accounted for. The time for subtlety is over. The steppe itself will become a weapon." Far to the east, the Qing Emperor Xuanji's generals orchestrated their own strategy. They were no longer merely moving troops. They were constructing a network of fortifications along rivers and valleys, building supply depots, and integrating tribal auxiliaries into their ranks. Cavalry scouts mapped every hill, stream, and forested knoll. Xuanji, well aware of the limitations his forces faced in the steppe's vastness, emphasized discipline and coordination. "We do not fight merely to kill," he told his generals. "We fight to dominate the land, to bend the nomads into a pattern they cannot resist. Victory requires both courage and precision." Meanwhile, the Mughal Empire watched with cautious interest. Emperor Shah Jahan, seated in the marble halls of Agra, contemplated the strategic implications. "If we intervene, it must be with subtlety. If we watch and wait, we can reap the benefits without overextending ourselves." His advisors had prepared detailed reports estimating troop movements, potential outcomes, and the likely costs of entanglement. Merchants traveling the Silk Road brought intelligence from Persia, the steppes, and even distant Ottoman provinces. The world was suddenly interconnected in ways that none of the rulers could ignore. The Safavids, sensing an opportunity, had begun reinforcing positions in the Western Khanates, using wealth, coercion, and diplomacy to ensure loyalty. Persian envoys traveled nightly across snow-laden passes, carrying gold, treaties, and subtle threats. Their aim was not direct conquest, but influence, an empire built not only on military strength, but on the power of persuasion and strategic alignment. And then the Ottomans moved. Although thousands of miles from the steppes, their spies and emissaries worked tirelessly, feeding misinformation to Safavid and Kazakh leaders alike. Ottoman cannon found their way into the hands of select khans, ostensibly gifts but with instructions to alter the balance of local power. Every empire had stakes, every army had eyes and ears embedded far from home, and every action could ripple across continents. The first major engagement occurred near the foothills of the Tian Shan Mountains, a natural corridor between the northern steppes and the rich valleys of Central Asia. Kazakh cavalry, swift and relentless, harried Qing supply lines, forcing units into precarious positions. Artillery fire from Qing positions devastated open steppe charges, yet Abdur-Rashid had anticipated this. Hidden ravines and marshes funneled Qing troops into traps where mobility was restricted. The clash was brutal, chaotic, and unrelenting. For days, neither side could claim decisive victory, but the cost in lives and morale was staggering. During the night, spies and envoys carried messages to Mughal and Safavid courts. One Safavid agent, disguised as a traitor, wrote in his journal, "The world is changing. No one empire can claim dominion. Victory lies in cunning, not brute force." Meanwhile, Ottoman envoys observed from afar, noting every deployment, every maneuver, and every misstep, sending coded messages back to Constantinople that would shape future strategies. Amid the chaos, human stories persisted. Soldiers wrote letters to their families, lamenting the horrors and celebrating small victories. Scholars recorded the strange beauty of the battles, the interplay of terrain, strategy, and human resilience. Merchants risked their lives to bring essential supplies to beleaguered camps. Each individual, though small in the grand sweep of empires, contributed to the unfolding history. As spring melted into summer, the convergence reached its zenith. Rashid, recognizing that neither total conquest nor annihilation was possible, called for a council. Qing generals, exhausted by the harsh terrain and attrition, agreed to talks, seeing the benefit of stabilizing the region rather than continuing costly campaigns. Safavid and Ottoman emissaries joined as mediators, each seeking to secure advantage for their own empire without plunging the steppes into permanent chaos. The resulting treaty, drafted over days of negotiation and subtle threats, was a masterpiece of diplomacy. Boundaries were redrawn, trade agreements codified, military movements regulated, and promises of non-interference secured. But every clause carried double meaning, leaving room for future maneuvering. Rashid secured the autonomy of the Kazakh territories. Qing forces withdrew in disciplined columns, and Safavid influence expanded subtly in Western Khanates. Ottoman interests were preserved, and the Mughal Empire maintained its neutrality while securing advantageous trade rights. The steppes, once a battleground of endless conflict, became a stage for a fragile equilibrium. Empires had collided, tested their strength, and recognized that survival required more than war. It required intelligence, foresight, and cooperation born from necessity. The era of constant raids and unchecked expansion was ending. A new age of interwoven interests, treaties, and calculated diplomacy was beginning. Yet the story did not end in triumph for any single empire. Losses had been heavy, ambitions curtailed, and landscapes scarred. The lesson of the convergence was clear. The world was interconnected, and no power, however great, could act in isolation. From this crucible, future generations would inherit a complex tapestry of alliances, rivalries, and strategies, a web of empires forever linked by blood, gold, and ambition. As Rashid watched the sun set over the steppes, the distant silhouette of Qing banners fading into the horizon, he understood that history was not merely the story of battles won or lost, but of choices made, alliances forged, and the subtle shaping of destiny. The era of open conflict had reached its conclusion, but the currents of power, influence, and ambition would continue to flow, preparing the world for new epic sagas yet to unfold. The Great Convergence had ended, the steppes were silent, and the empires, though battered and cautious, remained alive, poised for the next chapter in humanity's relentless story of power, ambition, and survival. The story of the Central Asian convergence became legend, a tale of strategy, diplomacy, resilience, and the intricate dance of empires that defined the age. And so, as the first stars appeared over the Tian Shan Mountains, signaling the quiet conclusion of a tumultuous era, the world waited. The empires would rest briefly, but the pulse of ambition, curiosity, and human ingenuity would never fade. The stage was set for the next great narrative, one born from the convergence of forces that had shaped continents and destinies, where the lessons of history would guide, and sometimes betray, the rulers of tomorrow.